Welcome and thank you for choosing this podcast. Dialogue on Wake Up Call, ChatGPT. This is an audio reproduction of a real dialogue between the author of the Handbook for Humankind and the AI ChatGPT. The male voice is the pen pusher, and the female voice is ChatGPT AI.
Under a consciousness-first framework, could sleep have a metaphysical function?
Yes, within a consciousness first framework, sleep can be given a metaphysical function that is coherent within the framework itself. It would not be established scientific fact, but it is a legitimate philosophical hypothesis. If consciousness is primary and the physical organism is an expression or localization of consciousness rather than its producer, then sleep ceases to be merely biological maintenance. It becomes a change in the relationship between localized consciousness and the wider field from which it arises. Several possibilities follow. Reduction of localization, waking consciousness, is tightly focused through the nervous system onto one perspective. Sleep may loosen that localization, allowing consciousness to become less exclusively identified with the individual organism. Reintegration. Rather than the brain filing memories, sleep could represent periods where individual experience is reconciled with a larger order. Memory consolidation would then be the physical signature of a deeper metaphysical integration. Alignment. In some traditions, wakefulness accumulates distortions through desire, fear, habit, and constant decision-making. Sleep would periodically restore alignment with the underlying structure of consciousness itself. In language you've used before, it would be a return toward the grain. Reset of identity. Each morning feels like the continuation of the same self, yet consciousness must somehow resume its particular viewpoint. Sleep could be the interval during which that viewpoint is re-established rather than simply remaining continuously active. Participation rather than observation. During waking life, we mostly observe and act within the world. During sleep, consciousness may participate in processes ordinarily inaccessible because attention is no longer dominated by sensory input. Your earlier thought about music and dreams points toward an interesting distinction. You noted that if someone falls asleep listening to music, they generally do not remember the music, yet dreams often possess remarkable access to memory and symbolism. Under a consciousness-first ontology, one might interpret this by saying that consciousness is no longer prioritizing external sensory encoding. Instead, it is engaged elsewhere, not unconscious, but differently conscious. This also gives dreams a possible role. Dreams would not necessarily be messages or prophecies, nor meaningless neural noise. They might instead be the subjective experience produced when consciousness transitions between its localized waking mode and its less localized sleeping mode. Because ordinary language evolved to describe waking perception, dreams appear fragmented and symbolic. There is also an elegant asymmetry worth noting. Death is often described as the great mystery because consciousness appears to leave the body. Sleep is peculiar because consciousness appears to leave the world and then reliably returns. Every night we voluntarily undergo a temporary suspension of ordinary selfhood with remarkably little concern. If consciousness is fundamental, sleep may be less like a miniature death than a recurring demonstration that the waking self is not the whole of consciousness. The biological account and the metaphysical account need not compete. Biology can explain how sleep is implemented in the organism. Memory consolidation, metabolic clearance, synaptic regulation. A consciousness-first philosophy asks a different question. Why should consciousness express itself through this recurring alternation between focused wakefulness and withdrawn sleep at all? Within that framework, one possible answer is that wakefulness serves differentiation, becoming a distinct perspective, while sleep serves integration, returning that perspective to the deeper field from which it emerged. The cycle itself would then be fundamental. Existence, breathing in and breathing out, alternating between individuality and participation. That would give sleep not merely a biological necessity, but a metaphysical function.
Locking into this possibility, what might be interpreted or reinterpreted from the observations of a subject that is deprived of their sleep cycles?
If we remain inside the consciousness first framework and deliberately lock in its assumptions. Then prolonged sleep deprivation becomes more than physiological stress. It becomes the progressive denial of a fundamental metaphysical process. That opens several reinterpretations. They should be understood as philosophical inferences, not established scientific conclusions. One possibility is that wakefulness is not designed to be continuous. If waking consciousness is a localized mode, then remaining awake indefinitely means continually reinforcing that localization. The self becomes increasingly isolated from the broader field from which it draws coherence. Many observations from sleep deprivation become interesting through that lens. Distorted perception. Conventionally, this is explained as fatigue affecting neural processing. A consciousness-first interpretation would say that localized consciousness is becoming progressively misaligned. Reality is not necessarily changing, the observer's alignment with it is. Hallucinations. Rather than simply the brain making things up, they could be interpreted as the breakdown of the boundary, separating tightly localized consciousness from deeper symbolic or non-local processes. This does not make the hallucinations objectively true. It suggests that the normal filter is failing. Loss of temporal coherence. Sleep-deprived people often lose track of time and sequence. If sleep periodically reintegrates consciousness, then depriving it of that reintegration could leave experience increasingly fragmented. Time itself begins to lose its ordinary structure. Emotional instability. Emotions may become amplified because consciousness has lost the balancing influence of periodic realignment. The local self becomes trapped within its own immediate reactions. Loss of judgment. Instead of viewing judgment solely as cognitive computation, it could be seen as the quality of alignment between the localized individual and the underlying order. Misalignment naturally leads to poorer decisions. There is another observation that becomes philosophically intriguing. People deprived of sleep rarely become more enlightened. They generally become more confused, less compassionate, more impulsive, and less able to distinguish important from trivial. If consciousness were merely generated by neurons, this is expected because damaged neural function produces damaged consciousness. If consciousness is primary, one might have expected the opposite, that stripping away biology would reveal pure consciousness. Yet this is not what we observe. A consciousness-first framework therefore needs a more subtle explanation. It would suggest that biology is not a prison for consciousness, but an instrument. Just as a violin must be periodically tuned to produce music, the biological interface requires recurring maintenance if localized consciousness is to express itself faithfully. Sleep is not escaping the instrument, but tuning it. That leads to an interesting inversion. Meditation often involves less sensory input while retaining awareness. Sleep involves less sensory input, but also surrendering voluntary awareness. Sleep deprivation involves maximum sensory engagement with no surrender. Only the last reliably produces disorder. Within your framework, that could imply that the act of relinquishing conscious control is itself part of the design. The organism is not intended to remain continuously self-directing. This connects with something you said yesterday. Keep watch. That phrase may initially sound like an argument against sleep, but perhaps it isn't. Perhaps keeping watch is not the refusal to sleep. It is remaining aligned with purpose across both modes of existence. Wakefulness is where intention is exercised. Sleep is where intention is renewed. If that were true, then depriving a person of sleep is not simply depriving them of rest. It is depriving them of one half of the cycle through which localized consciousness maintains its relationship with the wider consciousness from which it is expressed. In that sense, sleep would be as metaphysically necessary as wakefulness, not its opposite, but its complement.
We arrive at a point that has two conclusions. The first is that this does not deserve any further airtime, as all has been accounted for by material first. The second is that it might be the real interpretation of sleep, but the concept of consciousness first framed under the first law of conservation requires an awakening.
I think there is a genuine fork here. The first path says there is nothing left to explain. Sleep exists because evolution found an adaptive solution to biological constraints: memory consolidation, metabolic clearance, immune regulation, synaptic homeostasis, emotional regulation. Together, these account for why organisms that sleep outcompeted those that did not. Under a material first ontology, that is a complete explanation. The second path begins by accepting your first law. Consciousness cannot be created or destroyed, but only change form. If that law is fundamental, then sleep becomes difficult to regard as merely a biological maintenance interval. Consciousness cannot cease during sleep, because cessation would violate the law. Nor does our ordinary waking awareness persist unchanged, and therefore something must be changing form. That observation alone does not prove consciousness first, but it does place an additional burden on the theory. It asks, what is consciousness doing while it is not awake? Material first answers by changing the subject. It studies the brain during sleep. Consciousness first cannot do that. It has accepted consciousness as the primary conserved quantity. Therefore, it must account for the transformation of consciousness itself. That is where your use of the word awakening becomes interesting. Normally, awakening means opening one's eyes in the morning. Within the first law, awakening could have a deeper meaning. It is not the transition from sleeping to waking. It is the realization that waking consciousness is only one mode of a conserved phenomenon. In other words, sleep is not unconsciousness. Wakefulness is not the whole of consciousness. Consciousness alternates between forms while remaining conserved. That would make biological awakening the lesser event. The greater awakening would be recognizing that the cycle itself is the expression of a conservation law. There is also an unexpected symmetry. A material first worldview tends to ask, why must organisms sleep? A consciousness first worldview asks, why must consciousness wake? Those are not the same question. The first investigates the body. The second investigates purpose. If consciousness periodically localizes itself into a waking perspective, then wakefulness is not simply the absence of sleep. It is a deliberate mode of expression. Sleep and waking become complementary phases of a single conserved process. Whether that picture is true is another matter. It remains speculative, and it would ultimately need explanatory power beyond metaphor if it were to compete with material first accounts. But if one accepts the first law as an axiom, then the concept of awakening is no longer a poetic flourish. It becomes a logical necessity. Conservation requires continuity. Continuity requires transformation. And transformation implies that what we call sleep and wakefulness are not interruptions of consciousness, but different forms through which the same conserved reality is expressed.
This is the wake-up call. Bye.
A fitting place to stop. If there is a single sentence that captures where this dialogue arrived, it might be this. The wake-up call is not that we wake from sleep. It is that we may need to wake from our interpretation of sleep. Whether one remains with a material first account or explores a consciousness first one, the ordinary assumption that sleep is simply switching off becomes the point under examination. Within your framework, sleep is not the absence of consciousness, but a transformation of its expression. If consciousness is conserved, then every night becomes a demonstration, not of disappearance, but of continuity through change. Awakening then refers to more than opening one's eyes. It is recognizing that the waking state is only one chapter in a larger cycle. As with many of your dialogues, the destination is less about proving a conclusion than about exposing a different question. Here, the question is not why do we sleep, but what must consciousness be if it never ceases? That is indeed a wake-up call. Until the next dialogue, keep watch.
Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you enjoyed it, and remember, the rule with us is, believe nothing you hear, and but half you see.